near you right this minute, and you would never in 100 years guess who owns it now. To understand how something this big just slips off the map, you have to go all the way back to 1859 to New York City, where a young man named George Huntington Hartford was working for a merchant named George Gilman, and the two of them stumbled onto an idea so simple it seems obvious now. Back then, a pound of tea cost a small fortune. It came in on sailing ships from the far side of the world. And by the time it had passed through a long line of middlemen, each one taking his little cut along the way, the price on the shelf was outrageous. So Gilman and Hartford went straight down to the docks and started buying their tea and coffee right off the ships as they came in, at the price the cargo sold for, cutting out every middleman in between. And they turned around and sold it to ordinary families for a fraction of what everyone else was charging. That was the whole idea. Buy it direct, sell it cheap, and sell an ocean of it. Keep that in the back of your mind, because that one plain idea is where this story begins, and believe it or not, it's also exactly where it ends. And these two were not quiet about it. This was no dusty little shop on a corner. The early stores were a show. Bright red and gold storefronts, teams of horses pulling the delivery wagons through the streets, a live cockatoo greeting you at the door, and a cashier's booth built to look like a Chinese pagoda. On a Saturday night, they'd spin a big prize wheel by the counter so you'd buy your tea, take your spin, and maybe walk out with a whole set of dishes you hadn't paid for. And there was no wandering the aisles on your own back then. You walked up to a long wooden counter, handed your list to a clerk, and he did all the work, reaching down the cans, scooping your flour and your sugar out of big wooden bins, weighing everything out, and adding it all up in pencil right on the side of a paper bag. Buying groceries was an event, something you actually looked forward to. And in 1869, with the brand new railroads stitching the country together from the Atlantic clear to the Pacific for the very first time, they gave the company that big coast-to-coast name to match the ambition. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, A&P. For 50 years it grew the slow, patient way, one store at a time, until 1912, when one of the founder's sons, John Hartford, talked the family into a gamble that changed everything. He said, let's strip the whole thing all the way down, no credit, no delivery, none of the frills. Just a tiny store with one man behind the counter and prices so low nobody could touch them. Cash only. They called it the economy store, and it cost about $3,000 to open one top to bottom. The family was sure it would fail. Instead, it caught fire, and they started opening these little stores everywhere you looked, 585 of them in a single year. Then a few years later, thousands, going up faster than anybody could keep count. And here is where, if you're old enough, I can stop explaining and you can just nod along, because you were there. You already know what met you the moment you walked in, that deep roasted coffee smell rolling off the big grinder near the front, where a man would grind your beans fresh while you waited and pour them into a red and gold bag. 8 o'clock coffee. You can probably smell it right now if you close your eyes. And it was never just the coffee that got you. Every one of those stores had a real meat counter in the back, a butcher in a white apron who knew your family by name, sawdust down on the floor, and a long glass case of meats he would cut and trim and wrap up in white paper right in front of you while you waited. The produce sat out in wooden crates, stacked up in bright pyramids of apples and oranges. Their own fresh bread came out of the oven still warm on a good morning, so the whole place smelled like coffee and warm bread and butcher paper all at once. You did not just grab things off a shelf and leave, you talked to people, the butcher, the cashier, the neighbors you ran into halfway down the aisle. You remember your mother's hand on the cart, and the sound the wooden floors made in the older stores, and you remember the stamps, those little books of trading stamps A&P handed out that you'd sit and lick and paste into a booklet at the kitchen table night after night until you'd saved up enough for a new toaster or a lamp out of the catalog. That was a whole evening for a family. gathered around the table over a book of grocery stamps. And when your cart was finally full, the cashier rang the whole order up by hand, one key at a time, called out your total, and somebody packed it all into brown paper sacks. Half the time, a neighborhood kid was waiting to carry those sacks out to your car for a nickel. Little things, every one of them. But that was the shape of a whole week, and it all happened at the A&P. And that's the thing I want you to really understand before we go any further. A&P was not just a place you shopped. It was part of the furniture of American life. The low prices were the real product, and the groceries almost came second. It's worth holding on to, because they got so good at being cheap, so far below everyone else, that they slowly turned themselves into the most resented company in America. And the people they kept undercutting were quietly starting to keep score, though nobody standing in those stores felt a thing yet. By 1930, A&P had pulled off something no company in America had ever managed, growing to almost 16,000 stores. And the sheer size of it is hard to picture even now. It was twice as big as Sears, 4 times the size of Kroger, and it stood as the largest retailer of any kind in the entire United States. A title it would hold for 50 straight years, from 1915 all the way to 1965. It was one of the first 2 companies in all of American history to sell $1 billion worth of anything in a single year. For a while there, 1 out of every $10 Americans spent on food ran through this one company. Picture the Amazon of today, then remember A&P did it with horses and streetcars and ledgers kept by hand. For a good stretch of the last century, you were never really more than a few minutes from one. In plenty of towns, run down to the A&P did not even point at a specific errand, it just meant groceries. The same way people say run to the store today. The name and the thing had quietly become the same word. And what a lot of people never realized is that A&P didn't just sell you groceries, it made them. That coffee, the 8 o'clock, that was theirs. And it was no little sideline. By 1930, it was the single most popular coffee in the country, with A&P selling better than a quarter of all the coffee in America, and there were years where the coffee alone earned the company more money than every one of its thousands of stores put together. A grocery chain that was secretly one of the largest coffee companies on the planet. And it was not just the one blend either. There was 8 o'clock, the everyday coffee in the red bag, but there was also Red Circle, a step up from that, and Bocar, the dark, rich one at the top, and people had their favorites and argued about them the way folks argue over coffee today. All 3 ground fresh for you right there at the counter. They baked their own bread under the name Marvel, canned their own vegetables under Ann Page, ran their own bakery line called Jane Parker, and if you had a grandmother in those years, you have eaten a Jane Parker fruitcake at Christmas whether you liked it or not. They even launched their own magazine, Woman's Day, that you could grab at the checkout for 2 cents, and they sponsored a radio program half the country tuned in to hear. This was not a store anymore. This was an empire, and it made the Hartford family almost unimaginably rich. Through the very worst years of the Great Depression, while the rest of the country stood in breadlines, A&P was quietly posting some of the best profits it had ever seen, and the Hartford children were each collecting millions of dollars a year. Now hold on to one name here, a grandson named Huntington Hartford, because much later on he's going to do something with all that money that tells you everything about how this whole story ends. Here's a moment that should have been a flashing warning light, and nobody read it as one. A&P very nearly missed the supermarket entirely, that big, modern, everything under one roof store we all take for granted now. When one of their own employees, a man named Michael Cullen, brought them the idea and laid it right on their desk, they turned him down flat. So Cullen walked out the door, opened his own enormous store called King Cullen, and it was a runaway hit, and A&P was left scrambling to copy the very thing it had just waved away. They caught up, they always caught up, opening their first real supermarket, a big one, in Braddock, Pennsylvania, in 1936, and they went all in. knocking down 5 or 6 of the little old stores and putting one big one in their place, until by 1950 they were running 4,000 supermarkets. On paper, still sitting comfortably on top of the world. But look a little closer, and you can already see the hairline crack running through it. A&P was a company that hated to change, that had to be dragged toward every new idea. And that same stubbornness, that same deep love of doing things the way they'd always been done, was about to walk straight into the biggest change in American life in a century. Because the whole country was about to pack up and move to the suburbs, and A&P, with thousands of its little stores anchored to aging city street corners, was standing in exactly the wrong place. None of that showed yet, though. In its glory years, A&P was simply the king, feeding a nation from more towns than anyone had ever reached. And if any of this is bringing your own store back to you, your Saturday, your childhood, do me one small favor and tap that subscribe button, because this whole channel is about the places we all loved and lost. And I'd be glad to have you along for the ride. Because from this mountaintop, this is where the long, slow slide begins. Remember that one simple idea the whole company was built on: buy direct and sell cheap. Well, by the 1940s, A&P had gotten so big and so cheap that it had made itself a long list of enemies. Every small grocer who couldn't come close to its prices. Every supplier it had squeezed for a better deal, and for years they'd all been carrying their complaints straight to Washington. And Washington finally listened. On September 21st, 1946, in a federal courtroom in Danville, Illinois, a judge convicted the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company of breaking the nation's antitrust laws. And he convicted the 2 elderly Hartford brothers right along with it, George, who was 81, and John, who was 74. And this is the part that still stops me cold every time. They were not convicted for cheating anybody. They were not convicted for gouging a single customer. They were convicted more or less for the opposite, for using their tremendous size to keep prices too low, for being too good a bargain. One government lawyer stood up in the middle of it and called A&P a gigantic bloodsucker. And what he meant by that, incredibly, was that they sold food too cheaply for everyone else's comfort. The company that had spent nearly 100 years making groceries affordable for working families got hauled into court and branded a criminal for it, and each brother was fined $10,000. And a few years after that, the government came back and tried to break the whole company into 7 separate pieces. Now, the fine itself was pocket change to men like the Hartfords, but the fine was never really the damage. The real damage happened somewhere you couldn't see it, inside their own heads. Because after all those years of being attacked for being cheap, A&P slowly grew afraid of being cheap. The men steering the company began backing away from the one thing that had built the whole empire. They stopped fighting so hard to be the lowest price in town. They let their prices drift upward, and the moment they did that, they quietly let go of the only thing that had ever set them apart. They forgot who they were. And then they lost the 2 men who still remembered. John Hartford died in 1951, a heart attack, in an elevator in the Chrysler Building in New York. George held on until 1957, passing away at 92, and with the 2 of them gone, the family that had run this thing for nearly 100 years was, for all practical purposes, finished. The company passed into the hands of a loyal old lifer who had come up through the ranks, and into a charitable foundation the family had set up, which now owned an enormous share of A&P. And that foundation needed money, steady money, every single year to do its work. So instead of taking the company's profits and plowing them back into new stores where they were desperately needed, A&P shipped huge amounts of that money right out the door as dividends, in some years better than 70 cents of every single dollar the company earned. That was the slow leak. All that wealth flowing out to the family and the foundation year after year was money that never made it into the one place it had to go. Which brings us back to the suburbs. While A&P was standing still and quietly starving itself, the rest of America got in the car and drove to the edge of town into new houses along the new highways. And Kroger and Safeway and a dozen sharp regional chains followed those customers right out there and put up bright modern supermarkets to greet them. A&P mostly didn't. It stayed put in its small, aging city corner stores, watching its own customers drive further and further away. The numbers are almost painful. Through the 1950s, A&P's sales inched up around 65%. While every one of its four biggest rivals grew more than 200% in the very same stretch. It hadn't lost a thing yet, it had simply stopped moving while everyone else ran on past. By the early 1970s, they finally panicked, and the way they panicked is almost hard to watch. They decided, all at once, to become the cheapest again, overnight. Slashing prices as low as they could possibly go across nearly every store they had. A giant program they called WEO, where economy originates. And it set off a price war so brutal it nearly dragged the entire grocery industry down with it. But here was the trouble. A&P had spent 25 years forgetting how to run cheap, and their old, tired stores simply couldn't do it and still make a dime. So they dropped their prices to the floor, and then they just lost money on nearly everything they sold. In one single year, 1972, A&P lost $51 million on more than $6 billion in sales, and a writer at the time called it, flat out, an act of corporate suicide. They lunged for the crown they had already thrown away, and it very nearly took the whole company down with it. After that, it was just a long, quiet goodbye, store by store, year by year. They brought in the first outsider ever to run the place, and he began closing locations by the hundreds, and every one of those darkened stores had been somebody's whole morning. A manager who'd run your local A&P for 20 years and knew your order before you reached the register. The teenager working that first job on the checkout for their very first paycheck. The older woman who came in every Thursday for the same few things and a little conversation. One quiet closing at a time, in town after town, and almost nobody on the outside made a sound about it. In 1979, a German company bought control of whatever was left, and it just kept shrinking. Decade after decade, fading out of one town after another until most people didn't even realize it was still hanging on. There was a bankruptcy in 2010, and then a final one in 2015, and in November of that year, the very last A&P stores in America shut their doors for good, closing the book on 156 years. And remember that grandson I told you to hold on to, Huntington Hartford. He inherited a mountain of A&P money, and he spent his whole life finding inventive ways to burn it to the ground. An art museum that flopped, a resort down in the Bahamas, a modeling agency, even a company devoted to analyzing people's handwriting, until one of the greatest fortunes in America had mostly just evaporated. The family built the biggest store in the world, and a generation later, a good chunk of that money was simply gone, which is honestly the whole story of A&P told in one man. So, who killed A&P? The honest answer is that nobody did. There's no villain in this one at all. The government took a bite, the lawyers took a bite, the family took its money, the suburbs pulled the customers away, and 100 small decisions made by tired people who genuinely loved the place, each took a little more. It wasn't murdered, it just slowly slipped away while everyone was busy living their lives. The same quiet way so many of these places went. But if you want the one true reason underneath all of it, it's the one we started with. A&P was built on being the cheapest. That was its whole beating heart. And the day it grew frightened of being cheap, the day it forgot what it was, that was the day it began to die. The very thing that made it the biggest store the country had ever seen was the thing it let slip through its fingers. And once that was gone, there was nothing left holding the whole thing up. Here's the sweet little surprise to leave you with, though, because it isn't all gone. That coffee, the 8 o'clock, the smell that met you at the